Well, to discuss the significance of this, we're now joined by senior researcher at the Afro-Middle East Center, Ebrahim Deen. Ebrahim, thanks very much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Always good to have you. How significant is Gaddafi's son entering the political fray in this way?
I think the significance is the fact that by virtue of him entering, it shows what the current situation of Libya is, that the person who was intricately involved in what the uprising was against is actually now allowed and able to run and still has some support from within the south. And also that the person who is, who is sought for crimes against humanity and war crimes by the ICC is allowed to run. So it shows how the situation in Libya has become chaotic over the past 10 years since the overthrow of Gaddafi, and the fact that many, are still nostalgic, disillusioned, and want to actually move back to a situation where it was pre the uprising, that some are willing to sacrifice democracy in a sense for peace, security, and stability.
That people would say that they long for the days of Gaddafi. That's
the main reasoning, the field is a chaotic field. They say for Islam, there's, as you said, Khalifa Haftar, Agila Saleh may also join in, Fatih Bishagha may join in as well from the West. But, aside from the election and the candidates in the election, the process of elections is actually very flawed. There isn't really a proper constitutive process to actually carry out this election. And the international community has actually, in a sense, forced this election. I think it's been postponed a few times. But this election may actually cause more problems than actually be a solution if there's no real guideline and roadmap to actually ensure a transition and that everyone is included in this transition. And, unfortunately, it seems as if now we're going to be focusing on the candidates, which I think is significant because we're seeing people, for example, Saif al-Islam wanting to go back, but also the fact that these divisions over the past 10 years have become calcified, and it needs to be a way of actually reconciliation, a way of consensus. We're already seeing with Saif al-Islam, offices in Misrata, for example, getting stormed because many argue that the Electoral Commission should not have actually endorsed his candidacy, should not have allowed him to run. So, even the fact that he's allowed to run is in fact, becoming a problem. And it shows how the situation in Libya where there is no real consensus currently.
Is he not still facing charges even within Libya?
So, there has been courts that have called for him to face charges in Libya. He's also been indicted in the International Criminal Court, and many argue that's why he should not actually be allowed to contest. But it shows the current situation of Libya, where we have, for example, Khalifa Haftar, who's been accused of torture, of arbitrary killings, of bringing mercenaries into the country. He's also running. And if you're looking at the record, Khalifa Haftar's record is far worse than Saif al-Islam. So it shows how, Libya is now, in a sense, becoming an arena where it's not about the reputation of the person or the integrity of the candidate, but it's actually about the outside support he can have, the arms he has, and some of the tribal allegiances, which is actually trumping out popular voices and civilian participation.
The elections, as you say, perhaps are not going to be the best measure of anything, but does al-Saif enjoy significant support? Is he a potentially serious candidate?
I think he does have support from within the south. So, when Gaddafi was overthrown, the south, much of the tribes weren't overthrown. And so he has support from the south, and that's why he announced his candidature in the south. He also has some support from the tribes in the east, and support from, the elders, those who have the nostalgia. So he does have, in a sense, some support, but it doesn't seem as if it's not large and broad support, from a wide SWAT society. It's very constrained. And in actual fact, it may actually eat up into some of the support that Khalifa Haftar, for example, has. So, they may be contesting over similar support. And I mean, what he does, however, have is, he does have international linkages still. He has some of the tribes in the south, but also he doesn't possess, unlike Khalifa Haftar, unlike Fatih Bishara, he doesn't have loyal militia. And that may actually be, one of the impediments to him actually going far in a post-election process.
So we had already a chaotic situation in the country. Does his entrance into the political fray complicate things and maybe add to the chaos?
I think his entrance is emblematic of the chaos.
Okay.
For a person like him to actually arise shows how Libya has deteriorated over the past 10 years. And so, the chaos is actually that he's actually allowed to run. Now, I think there needs to be consensus and there needs to be unification and there needs to be some sort of election, because it doesn't seem as if other methods have worked so far over the past 10, 15 years. Over the past 10 years, basically, 7 years since 2014. So there has to be some process. The problem is what happens going up to the process and outside and after the election. And I think the big issue in Libya currently is the fact that outside powers are still involved, that there's still Turkish troops, there's still Russian-backed mercenaries, there's still Egyptian support for Khalifa Haftar. And, these actually complicate the situation because, any electoral loser will actually try to fall back on these militia groupings. Saif al-Islam can't do that. But it shows that, currently people like Khalifa Haftar, like Fatih Bishara, and it's actually going to use the elections to actually legitimize, the power they have or the military power they have. And that's the problem with elections, that it actually seems as if it's the old guard that are taking part, and not actually new young blood that may represent popular participation, popular sentiment, and, a new way of actually moving Libya forward.
It does seem that Libya is a very divided country. On what lines is it split? What is the basis of the splits?
So there's different splits. So there's the East-West split, where the Eastern tribes do believe that they haven't been given enough of influence and power in Libya, even though most of the resources from Libya come from the East. So the East-West split. Then there's the split between the tribes and the younger populations. The tribes who, many of them still support Gaddafi and likely will support Hifter. And, the more popular, the younger citizens that may want more democratic consolidation and democracy. There's, in a sense, a division between the different regions within the East and the different regions within the West, such as your Misrata and your Zitan, for example, in the West. The more Islamist and the less Islamist components of the populace. And so there is much division in the country. And there needs to be a unifying vision now. If they can't agree, and they haven't yet agreed properly on a constituency, on a constitutional basis for the election, this election is causing more disagreement than agreement. We saw some agreement last year and towards the start of this year, but it just seems as if the process has stalled. And I think the process is stalled because I think the international community have not placed enough emphasis on Libya. From March this year, when the agreement for elections happened, the transitional government was forced in, there wasn't enough international action that was continued. Basically, the international community said now an election would sort it out. When in actual fact, the process needed to be moved from them and actually try and find a consensual solution that actually, would. Libya is in serious, in serious trouble and may actually, divide depending on the result of the election. And I think, the international community specifically is not taking that, and also into consideration, and free riders. Unfortunately, your Egypt, your Turkey, your Russia are involved in Libya itself, and involved and have interest in the conflict and in the result and the outcome of the election. And I think there's not enough action being taken to actually to actually, in a sense, enforce compliance, actually allow Libyans to find the solution, or Libyans on the ground to find the solution, a more consensus-based and consensual solution to the problem in Libya.
The election may go ahead, but one gets a sense that Khalifa Haftar is not going to accept anything but a victory. And with an army, it can be a major headache for the country if he doesn't win.
That's the big issue. I mean, he's using this clause which allowed him to retire from the army for 3 months. So he's going to run. And if he wins the election, then he'll be president and commander of the army. If he doesn't win the election, he's already laid the ground for an attempt to conquer the country with force. And that didn't work last time. It's very unlikely it's going to work now, because the Western coalition, for example, is even strong. But it shows how this external support is allowing him to. He shouldn't be allowed to contest, the election. Still in command in the sense of the army, still having a lot of force. But it shows how these regional actors are shaping the situation in Libya. And unfortunately, a candidate that emerges is likely going to be a candidate that's actually endorsed by one of these powers, be it Turkey or be it Egypt. And that's actually not necessarily good for Libya as a whole, for democracy as a whole. There's no, we're looking at the candidates currently since last week. It's the old guard, and it's your militia commanders, it's your old people who've been involved since 2011 and prior. There's no new candidates that seem to be popular. And that shows how, the different cleavages and the divisions that are still existent, that, it's now 11 years. 10 years, and 9 years since Gaddafi was overthrown. But, yet saying so, there's still issues about, there's still no new leaders emerging. It's actually the old guard and this nostalgia for the past.
You talk about the international community. I mean, they've tried. They've sat down. We've had, 2 Berlin conferences, and one just doesn't get a sense that there is any kind of real solution that's being put on the table that any of the parties will genuinely abide by.
I think that's the problem, is that there's a lot of free riding in the international community. So you have, for example, your Egypt calling for the pullout of all the troops when it supplies one of the factions in Libya. You have and I think that those regional aspects, the oil in Libya, the deal about the Mediterranean or the Eastern Mediterranean, naval zone and exploration zone. These deals and these interests are actually meaning that the international community, in a sense, is speaking with a forked tongue. It's speaking in one way, and there's very good statements but on the ground, it's a different story. And also there's a lack of enforcement. The troops were supposed to be pulled out since March. It's now December. The forces are still in, and there's actually been no attempt at actually trying to force compliance. And that means that, the international community and your different regional actors are actually using this election, and they want the outcome of this election to actually legitimize their current influence in the country. And I think, that's one of the issues that, Libya is not allowed, in a sense, or hasn't been allowed to actually come up with its own solutions because of, the fact that it's now involved in these regional ructions, over its future, and also the resources that it has.
Ebrahim Deen, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very, very much indeed. Your insights always greatly appreciated on the program. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.